Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 16th chapter of the 5th book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, its title being Lines of Communication. The text follows. The roads which lead from the position of an army to those points in its rear where its depots of supply and means of recruiting and refitting its forces are principally united, in which it is also in all ordinary cases chooses for its retreat, have a double signification. In the first place, they are its lines of communication for the constant nourishment of the combatant force, and the next they are roads of retreat. We have said in the preceding chapter that although according to the present system of subsistence, an army is chiefly fed from the district in which it is operating, it must still be looked upon as forming a wall with its base. The lines of communication belong to this wall. They form the connection between the army and its base, and are to be considered as so many great vital arteries. Supplies of every kind, convoys of munitions, detachments moving backwards and forwards, posts, orderlies, hospitals, depots, reserves of stores, agents of administration, all these objects are constantly making use of these roads, and the total value of these services is the utmost importance to the army. These great channels of life must therefore neither be permanently severed, nor must they be of too great length or beset with difficulties, because there is always a loss of strength on a long road which tends to weaken the condition of an army. By their second purpose, that is, as lines of retreat, they constitute in a real sense the strategic rear of the army. For both purposes, the value of these roads depends on their length, their number, their situation, that is their general direction, and their direction especially as regards the army, their nature as roads, difficulties of ground, the political relations and feeling of local population, and lastly, on the protection they derive from fortresses or natural obstacles of the country. But all the roads which lead from the point occupied by an army to its sources of existence and power are not on that account necessarily lines of communication for that army. They may no doubt be used for that purpose and may be considered as supplementary of the system of communication, but that system is confined to the lines regularly prepared for the purpose. Only those roads on which magazines, hospitals, stations, posts for dispatches and letters are organized under commandants with police and garrisons can be looked upon as real lines of communication. But here a very important difference between our own and the enemy's army makes its appearance, on which is often overlooked. An army, even in its own country, has its prepared lines of communication, but it is not completely limited to them, and can in case of need change its line, taking some other which presents itself, for it is everywhere at home, as officials in authority and the friendly feeling of the people. Therefore, although other roads may not be as good as those at first selected, there is nothing to prevent their being used, and the use of them is not to be regarded as impossible in case the army is turned and obliged to change its front. An army in an enemy's country, on the contrary, can as a rule only look upon those roads as lines of communication upon which it has advanced, and hence arises through small and almost invisible causes a great difference in operating. The army in the enemy's country takes under its protection the organization which, as it advances, it necessarily introduces to form its lines of communication. And in general, inasmuch as terror and the presence of an enemy's army in the country invests the measures in the eyes of the inhabitants with all the weight of unalterable necessity, the inhabitants may even be brought to regard them as an alleviation of the evils inseparable from war. Small garrisons left behind in different places support and maintain this system, but if these commissaries, commandants of stations, police, field posts, and the rest of the apparatus of administration were sent to some distant road upon which the army had not been seen, the inhabitants then would look upon such measures as a burden which they would gladly get rid of, and if the most complete defeats and catastrophes had not previously spread terror throughout the land, the probability is that the functionaries would be treated as enemies and driven away with very rough usage. Therefore, in the first place, it would be necessary to establish garrisons to subjugate the new line, and these garrisons would require to be of more than ordinary strength, and still there would always be a danger of the inhabitants rising and attempting to overpower them. In short, an army marching into an enemy's country is destitute of the mechanism through which obedience is rendered. It has to institute its officials in their places, which can only be done by a strong hand, and this cannot be effected thoroughly without sacrifices and difficulties, nor it is the work of a moment. From this it follows that a change of the system of communication is much less easy of accomplishment in an enemy's country than in our own, whether it is at least possible. And it also follows that the army is more restricted in its movements and must be much more sensitive about any demonstrations against its communications. But the choice and organization of lines of communication is from the very commencement subject also to a number of conditions by which it is restricted. Not only must they be in a general sense good high roads, but they will be more serviceable the wider they are, the more populous and wealthy towns they pass through, the more strong places there are which afford them protection. Rivers also, as means of water communication, and bridges as points of passage, have a decisive weight in the choice. It follows from this that the situation of a line of communication, and consequently the road by which an army proceeds to commence the offensive, is only a matter of free choice up to a certain point, its situation being dependent on certain geographical relations. All the foregoing circumstances taken together determine the strength or weakness of the communication of an army with its base, and this result, compared with one similarly obtained with regard to the enemy's communications, decides which of the two opponents is in such position to operate against the other's lines of communication, or to cut off his retreat, that is, in technical language, to turn him. Setting aside all considerations of moral or physical superiority, that part can only effectually accomplish this whose communications are the strongest of the two, for otherwise the enemy saves himself in the shortest mode by a counterstroke. Now, this turning can, by reason of the double signification of these lines, have also two purposes. Either the communications may be interfered with and interrupted, that the enemy may melt away by degrees from want, and thus be compelled to retreat, or the object may be directly to cut off the retreat. With regard to the first, we have to observe that a mere momentary interruption will seldom have any effect while armies are subsistent, as they now are. A certain time is requisite to produce an effect in this way in order that the losses of the enemy by frequent repetition may compensate in number for the small amount he suffers in each case. One single enterprise against the enemy's flank, which might have been a decisive stroke in those days, when thousands of bread wagons traversed the lines of communication, carrying out the systematized method then in force for subsisting troops, would hardly produce any effect now, if so ever successful. One convoy at most might be seized, which would cause the enemy some partial damage, but never compel him to retreat. The consequence is that enterprises of this description on a flank, which have always been more in fashion in books than in real warfare, now appear less of a practical nature than ever, and we may safely say that there is no danger in this respect to any lines of communication but such as are very long and otherwise unfavorably circumstanced, more especially by being exposed everywhere and at any moment to attacks from an insurgent population. With respect to the cutting off an enemy's retreat, we must not be overconfident in this respect either of the consequences of threatening or closing the enemy's lines of retreat, as recent experience has shown that, when troops are good and their leader resolute, it is more difficult to make them prisoners than it is for them to cut their way through the force opposed to them. The means of shortening and protecting long lines of communication are very limited. The seizure of some fortresses adjacent to the position taken up by the army and on the roads leading to the rear, or in the event of there being no fortresses in the country, the construction of temporary defenses at suitable points, the kind treatment of the people of the country, strict discipline on the military roads, good police, and active measures to improve the roads are the only means by which the evil may be diminished, but it is one which can never be entirely removed. Furthermore, what we said when treating of the question of subsistence with respect to the roads which the army should choose by preference applies to the particularly two lines of communication. The best lines of communication are roads leading through the most flourishing towns and most important provinces. They ought to be preferred, even if considerably longer. In most cases, they exercise an important influence on the definitive disposition of the army. So, this is an interesting chapter about lines of communication and what fundamentally serves to make them standing, and also what, how you can play on them fundamentally, and what's the advantage of doing it in this type of Napoleonic warfare von Clausewitz is describing at the moment. And so lines of communication, von Clausewitz says, the roads which lead from the position of an army to those points in its rear, where its depots of supply and means of recruiting and refitting its forces are principally united, and which it also in all ordinary cases chooses for its retreat, have a double signification. In the first place, they are its lines of communication for the constant nourishment of the combatant force, and next they are the roads of retreat. Right, so there are these lines of communications that connect the army essentially to the base of operation that we have described in the last chapter, and that, as we've seen, has a pretty, fluid, plastic, malleable dimension, right? And it changes at least every time. So it's not literally a physical thing, right? It's about the organization that von Clausewitz will expand a bit on also later. And von Clausewitz says these lines of communication fundamentally function both as, in fact, as supply lines, and also as lines of retreat, because because of the same existence of the base of operation. This is something we have read, and I remember how, I think 2 or 3 chapters ago, or 2 chapters ago, when we're speaking of Napoleon's retreat in 1812 along the same line of communication as, the obvious thing to do. Von Clausewitz will resume the topic here by explaining how naturally that is what supports, the base of operation you have literally built during the advance in enemy territory is what you are sustained by. So there is an important dependence on it, and especially when you're retreating. It's not like when you advance that you're literally creating these lines, these bases of operations, but at that point it's shrinking, and it obliges you to concentrate the forces, the mass, and this creates further problems for supplies, because fundamentally you can't go around foraging, because you have to keep your forces as united as possible in the face of an enemy that at that point is on the advantage, and that plus is happening in a territory where the population is increasingly hostile, so is actually working against your subsistence, and also because you have to speed the hell up to be faster than the enemy at that point to retreat. So this, as we've seen here now, and we're reading again, explaining, is exactly what happens, and you must always be wary of. That is to say, your bases of operations into enemy territory are crucial to preserve in case of retreat, because those can be literally the only mean of survival at that point of the army. Von Clausewitz says, we have said in the preceding chapter that although according to the present system of subsistence, which is fundamentally in loco, right, at the moment, right, without much of magazines or others, other prearranged systems, so the army mostly lives off the land, but still needs, right, this support of especially of troops and materiel from an outer land that may be even your own one, so not even in enemy territory that where you are, that you may be at that point. For Clausewitz says an army is chiefly fed from the district in which it is operating. In fact, it must be, however, it must still be looked upon as forming as a wall with its base. That is to say, even though, as we have repeated many times in many chapters here recently about subsistence, that is to say, von Clausewitz showed us how these armies have become so big that by the early 19th century, fundamentally there is no other way at that point to feed them but on the spot, because the supply chain could be excruciatingly costly otherwise, how complex it could be. And these armies are relatively, by their same bulk, paradoxically speedy, because they can hardly find somebody who is, clashing, against them. And when they find, it's because this tendency towards absolute war makes them clash less avoidably than before. So in the 18th century, supply chain was something, much more important for feeding the army proper, right? At this point, is that you have to consider that in spite of this, in spite of the living off the land on the spot, for the reasons we were describing above, the army still is forming a wall with its base of operations. That is to say, you can't cut off that line of communication with it, because otherwise it would stop receiving the essentials still for waging war still. And we've seen that these are mostly the irreplaceable, right? You can't find provisions on the spot, as we just said. You can't find men. You can't find new recruits. You can't find important assets, artillery and ammo. Yeah, you can find them, but not on a regular base, and you need that, and you can't produce it on the spot most of the time, especially in enemy territory. So this base of operations, for this and other numbers of reasons, is to be considered still one thing with what the army is doing, right? And as a sort of of emanation, right? Because it was created and kept up by the same military forces. Now we see how. Von Clausewitz says the lines of communication belong to this wall too. They form the connection, as we were saying, between the army and its base, and are to be considered as so many great vital arteries, so not something just accessory. Supplies, von Clausewitz writes, of every kind, convoys of munitions, detachments moving backwards and forwards, posts, orderlies, hospitals, depots, reserve stores, agents of administration, all these objects are constantly making use of these roads, and the total value of these services is of the utmost importance for the army. That is to say, even if the army lives off the land on the spot, still you have to arrange a whole amount of stuff that your army can't do without, right? To function properly, and more, right? There is, as we'll see now, there's specifically also strategical value to preserving your base of operations and the lines of communication of the army with it. Von Clausewitz says these great channels of life must therefore neither be permanently severed, right, nor must they be of too great length or beset with difficulties, because there is always a loss of strength on a long road which tends to weaken the condition of an army. The longer the road, the more these resources go dispersed. If this line is cut, of course, it's even worse. Von Clausewitz says, by their second purpose, that is of lines of retreat, as we were saying above, the lines of communications constitute in a real sense the strategic rear of the army. Right, you can spot this, even if it's not literally, it's normally the rear, yes, but as we've seen, the base of operation, it can be something very wide and articulated, so it's and scattered, so it's important to consider it in its strategic unity, right, as a rear, as a base of operation that you shouldn't place in the front where the enemy is coming from, right? So von Clausewitz says, for both of these purposes, of subsistence and retreat, the value of these roads depends on their length, their number, their situation, that is, their general direction, and their direction especially as regards the army, their nature as roads, difficulties of ground, the political relations and feeling of local population, and lastly, on the protection they derive from fortresses or natural obstacles in the country, right? So this is all a set of, qualities of features of these literal roads that you have to take into account. How easy it is to communicate through them. That's it, right? And it takes consideration here, importantly, as you understand, also the land, the country, that is, where does this cross in natural terms, in terms of terrain, the political relations and feeling of the local population, that, as we've seen here, it will be particularly important, right? Are there fortresses scattered around here? So all these factors interplay, right? And there, as you understand, they interplay also with properly the armed forces that are under your control at this point. And von Clausewitz says, but all the roads which lead from the point occupied by an army to its sources of existence and power are not on that account necessarily lines of communication for that army. This is important because it shows you that, what you have to look at is not what can be potentially used, but what actually works at the moment, right? And what can, of course, can be used in that sense, but not all roads function well as a line of communication, right? So this is quite important to understand. They may no doubt be used for that purpose, von Clausewitz says, and may be considered as supplementary of the system of communication, but that system is confined to the lines regularly prepared for the purpose, right? And that therefore have also offered, I would add, those preconditions that can make them work as such, right? You may have a perfect road ever, but the population living there may be hostile at the point you would risk badly making, supplies crossing there, passing through there. So that is the criterion must be used. Von Clausewitz says, only these roads on which magazines, hospitals, stations, posts for dispatches and letters are organized under commandants with police and garrisons can be looked upon as real lines of communication. So here, there are all these important magazines, hospitals, stations, posts for dispatches and letters. So you have everything. You have the stocks, the healing centers, the medical centers, the literally places you have to stop to rest. You have for keeping up communication with your own country, all these things. So these are become lines of communications proper if they are patrolled with if they have specific commandants there with a police and garrison system, right, that controls them, that makes them stay fit, so that it's not just to pass by and say, okay, well, organize an hospital here, then you go away for tens and hundreds of miles and nothing happens there. No, you have to have stationed someone there to control and to maintain a minimum of order that it's necessary to maintain that center in function. So von Clausewitz says, but a very important difference between our own and the enemy's army makes its appearance, on which it is often overlooked. An army, even in its own country, has its prepared lines of communication, but it's not completely limited to them, and can, in case of need, change its line, taking some other which presents itself, for it's everywhere at home, has officials in authority and friendly feeling of the people. Right? So in friendly country, it's dramatically easier to change your base of operations and consequently supply lines, because you're going to find much more resources on the spot and cooperation, right, generally speaking. Von Clausewitz says, therefore, although other roads may not be as good as those at first selected, there is nothing to prevent their being used, and the use of them is not to be regarded as impossible in the case the army is turned and obliged to change its front, right? An army, because of course it's going to be helped anyway by the local populace, and there is simply more readily available stuff. An army in an enemy's country, on the contrary, can as a rule only look upon those roads as lines of communication upon which it has advanced, as we were saying before, because it has not prearranged anything else out there. Anything else out there is in enemy territory, has a hostile populace. You have to at least conquer it to create that command system with police and garrison. and hence, von Clausewitz says, arises through small and almost invisible causes a great difference in operating. The army in the enemy's country takes under its protection the organization which, as it advances, it necessarily introduces to form its lines of communication. And in general, inasmuch as terror and the presence of an enemy's army in the country invests these measures in the eyes of the inhabitants with all the weight of unalterable necessity, the inhabitants may even be brought to regard them as an alleviation of the evils inseparable from war. Small garrisons left behind in different places support and maintain this system. There is an active work for keeping the army subsisting. But if these commissaries, commandants of stations, police, field posts, and the rest of the apparatus of administration were sent to some distant road upon which the army had not been seen, the inhabitants then would look upon such measures as a burden which they would gladly get rid of, and in the most complete defeats and catastrophes had not previously spread terror throughout the land, the probability is that these functionaries would be treated as enemies and driven away with a very rough usage. This is interesting because it's obvious that an army invading another country, I mean, it's hardly something unknown and, in its deterrent capacity, right? But it's obvious that here we're talking by degrees, so it's pretty natural that, yes, if the army has passed by somewhere else and these guys are sent there to say, okay, give us food and keep it going because of that army. Well, if there is not enough threat of force to actually obey, or to be obliged to obey, compelled to obey, the local populace is going to fight against. And you understand that in guerrilla warfare and this is pretty normal. I mean, every occupied country at some point is going to resort to resistance in some form. That is very subtle, and here they can be very subtle, but it's actually a hard form of war. And von Clausewitz is pointing this out on the base of, look especially at the lines of communication, right? Those are the ones where prevalently is going to be something, going on. Exactly because it's not where the army is, because there the army, as we've seen, can exact easily provisions from the local population without any opposition, basically because it's virtually insignificant, right? An army, the greatest armies of the world are in one place. What can civilians do? Nothing, right? It's a myth that, we have guns. You don't do anything with guns. You can't do things where, there is that low level enemy threat, right, where you can literally, the enemy is few and you can do something about it. Against an organized army, you can't do anything. So let's erase the lunacy, this delusion that guerrilla can do where big armies fail, right? Guerrilla can do exactly where big armies are not, right? And they can do a lot in that sense, but it's not simply because you can't police an entire country effectively at some point, or at least with huge costs that may not make it work. That's how guerrilla works. But when there is a whole army to be kicked out that is retreating, that guerrilla will materialize into another army on its own and push forward as an army, like not as guerrilla, right? So this is hard to make understand sometimes to people, because I don't know why in the West we've been so, it's a Freudian thing. We've been so like children. We've been traumatized by something that, I don't know, the fact that we lost a certain war. So, guerrilla now must be the most important thing ever. Every army, even the most powerful armies in the world have been defeated by guerrilla. No, it's technically not true. And it's technically exactly the other way around. It's you that do not even take into consideration the most elementary strategical notions, right? Leave things to those who are capable of doing them. And aside from that, von Clausewitz says, therefore, in the first place, it would be necessary to establish garrisons to subjugate the new line, and these garrisons would require to be of more than ordinary strength, and still there would be always a danger of the inhabitants rising and attempting to overpower them. In short, an army marching into an enemy's country is destitute of the mechanism through which obedience is rendered. It has to institute its officials into their places, which can only be done by a strong hand, and this cannot be effected thoroughly, without sacrifices and difficulties, nor is it the work of a moment, right? So the creation of this, this lines of communications at the base of operation, first of all, is something that is structured over time, that changes, as we've seen, that can be changed literally for strategical reasons. Doesn't stay always the same. That's why it becomes, in turn, a strategical matter itself. That is, why are you, using them? Specific, what's the enemy going to interfere like with them? That's quite important. And Von Clausewitz says, from this it follows that a change of the system of communication is much less easy of accomplishment in an enemy's country than in our ground, where it is at least possible, and it also follows the army is more restricted in its movements and must be much more sensitive about any demonstrations against its communications. Right? So you're put in a condition of disadvantage into enemy territory where you literally have that difficulty of doing all this, but with much greater vulnerability, right, and more than the capacity properly of going out there and seeking and finding supplies, exacting them, splitting your forces. It's really about the fact that there's a whole set of forces that are rowing backwards compared to what you're doing. Von Clausewitz says, then, but the choice of an organization of lines of communication is from the very commencement subject also to a number of conditions by which it is restricted. Not only must they be in a general sense good high roads, but they will be the more serviceable the wider they are, the more populous and wealthy towns they pass through, the more strong places there are which afford them protection. Rivers also as means of water communication, and bridges as points of passage, have a decisive weight in the choice. It follows from this that the situation of a line of communication, and consequently the road by which an army proceeds to commence the offensive, is only a matter of free choice up to a certain point, its situation being dependent on certain geographical relations. All the foregoing circumstances taken together determine the strength of the or weakness of the communication of an army with its base, and this result, compared with one similarly obtained with regard to the enemy's communications, decides which of the two opponents is in a position to operate against the other's lines of communication or to cut off his retreat, that is, in technical language, to turn him. Setting aside all considerations of moral physical superiority, that part can only effectually accomplish this whose communications are the strongest of the two, for otherwise the enemy saves himself for the shortest modes by a counterstroke. Here von Clausewitz is introducing a principle that we have already seen elsewhere regarding the difficulties that a surrounding maneuver, an enveloping maneuver represent for not just those who suffer it, but technically also for those who carry it out. We've seen that more specifically there is a disadvantage for an attacker to even detach for advancing from its line from its base of operations normally, and even more to performing this encircling maneuvers that increase the distance from there, and that we've seen that strategically how armies organized. There are with vanguards, for example, that increase with their advancement. Also, literally this space on the rear that the enemy has to go around, so increasing the distance from its own army, and you with your own vanguard from the enemy from the rest of your own army. So actually, it's a complicated matter. Von Clausewitz is saying here that, generally speaking, those who can perform these maneuvers better, are those who are better supplied. That is to say, yes, those who have the best lines of communications, that in spite of, or better exactly because of what we have said before, that is the capacity now these armies to essentially living off the land on the spot, etc., are much more capable of resisting an enveloping maneuver and actually not being properly damaged by it. Literally, also even where there are lines of communications being cut momentarily, because these system of supply is not so like it's something that lasts for a long time, right? It is meant for the sheer mass of these armies to last for a while before it runs out. So that is technically exposed. That is a damage for you, but it's exposing the enemy more. And therefore, at that point, the asymmetry that can be played on by the attackers mostly the having a better supplying situation, maybe being in friendly territory over an enemy that is of course in enemy one, but more precisely, there is even in here cumbersomeness of these armies that makes it much easier, right? First of all, much less feasible to find, to perform these scanning maneuvers, because the larger the armies are, not just they are literally bigger, therefore can easily be spotted, and they're kind of more, they move more with greater difficulty, and and all the things, but specifically because they have, by sheer strategical and also logistical reasons that we've seen in the past, the necessity of attacking straight, and therefore what can actually happen here is that you perform this surrounding maneuver, but actually it's much easier to perform a counterstroke, to suffer from a counterstroke in the process from the army that you're trying to attack. We've seen also how these armies are fundamentally made up of divisions that can form and reform in different changing fronts, etc. Also, that would of course mean to change lines of communication at some point, but it's not just that. It's properly the idea that while an enemy is performing this complicated maneuver, just punch on him straight, and that is something which is frankly much easier than it seems, right? Much more logical, and that's why also enveloping maneuvers, yes, if they are successful, they can reward you enormously, but at the same time, exactly, there is no shortcut in reality, in real war, right? That is as profitable as risky, right? That can give the profitable outcome the more you risk. So technically, most of the times you can't even, okay, let's do it. Let's encircle the enemy. Yes, that's a kind of let's outflank the enemy. That's a kind of a natural thing to seek for, but most times you won't have the opportunity of doing it. Right, you can't think it. Everybody knows that in the theory of the art of war, that's the first thing you should be looking at. But at the same time, war doesn't allow you to perform that frequently, right? Especially the larger the armies are, and therefore the more important whatever you're doing is, right? There is not a smart guy who comes up, I'm capable of doing it, right? No, there can be only big gambles in this that can be successful or not, but still are depending on a set of circumstances that you can't simply avoid and say, okay, let's do how I like in fantasy. No, unfortunately not. Then von Clausewitz says, now this turning, this outflank, can be, by reason of the double signification of these lines, have also two purposes. Either the communications may be interfered with and interrupted, that the enemy may melt away by degrees from want and thus be compelled to retreat, or the object may be directly to cut off the retreat, which is, as we've seen, specular to what basically the line of communications are about, subsistence and line of retreat. So the enemy can choose to do these two things, even at once, that is naturally trying to melt away the enemy army by essentially, sabotaging its supply lines, and wearing it out, or literally cutting the line of retreat, right? Which, as we've seen, it's happening, right? At the same, it's both happening at the same time, but cutting the line of retreat means literally you have to get yourself in between. So that is also what we were saying before. You have to have a hell of a an advantage in basal operations to actually profitably, cut off the enemy completely of a big army from its lines of operations, because normally the way the enemy has entered your territory, it's being functional to a way of, avoiding you getting in his rear, right? And the greater this invasion has been, and the less likely that there is any way of fixing that, because, of of overturning that, because yeah, I mean, there are major events like, I don't know, France or Germany, like they invade each other, right? They have that freaking border, right? And that's the direction they're gonna come, right? It's not that France is gonna move through I don't know, through Italy, through Hungary, through in Poland, and attack Germany from the rear, right? It's not possible. So the question there is, how do you cut the supply lines with France, if you're a German? In that case, that's the problem that von Clausewitz is talking about. So it's what we were saying before, in the sense that the larger the scope of this is, strategically speaking, the least you can do something about the situation. But were that possible, right, or higher, which can be done by increasing the risk. Think about the Schlieffen plan. In fact, was rubbish in many ways, right? And the greater, the accomplishment, yes, but greater also the possibility of failure. And that's exactly what happened, by the way, during World War I. Well, it was Germany invading France. But the question there is, there is always a reciprocity, and this reciprocity is valid exactly for its own sake, for both. That is, everything that is made on one side has a reflection on the other at the moment, and vice versa. So von Clausewitz analyzes these two objectives. Regarding to the first, that is melting away through sabotaging the supply lines and so on, we have to observe that a mere momentary interruption will seldom have any effect while armies are subsisted as now they are, because we have seen before that fundamentally the systems through which they are supplied are, you have literally to stand to corner that army, which is, they are so big that how the hell do you do it without crushing against it and giving battle normally, right? A certain time is requisite to produce an effect in this way, in order that the losses of the enemy by frequent repetition may compensate in number for the small amount he suffers in each case, right? That's also why guerrilla warfare, you may think, I don't know, during the 20th century was so effective in many circumstances, because it was not just, it was just guerrilla, because there was no other army to oppose the enemy. Why? Because the enemy armies were so big that you had nothing to resort but to, guerrilla at some point, right? In countries that, they had obviously a mixed system of that, but not even talking about fully occupied countries, of course, in this case, where there was properly another army fighting, but still guerrilla cooperating. Well, that's what guerrilla can do, right? And you declare through that at the moment you can't do otherwise, and that's why you're doing it in the first place, and it's effective at the same time. But it's never so intense, like literally cutting the enemy supply lines. And as we were just saying again, you may not be able to do it. It's easier to crush, to break through, as von Clausewitz will tell us now. Von Clausewitz says, one single enterprise against the enemy's flank, which might have been a decisive stroke in those days when thousands of bread wagons traversed the lines of communication. Look at the 7 Years' War, the Silesian campaigns. Carrying out the systematized method then in force for subsisting troops would hardly produce any effect now, if ever so successful. One convoy at most might be seized, which would cause the enemy some partial damage, but never compel him to retreat. And we have seen why. Because at this point, differently from the 18th century, these armies had become enormous and could supply themselves mostly on the spot. That they would be already prearranged to do. So even if there are always supplies arriving from somewhere else, but at the moment, right, the enemy is still capable most of the time to remain supplied for a consistent amount of time, during which he can simply strike back on you, right? So you won't make that damage that during the 7 years. We look at the campaigns between the Prussians and the Austrians. It was always about turning the enemy's flank. Why? Because it was all about that freaking logistical train, and you cut that, the army's over. Now it's not like that anymore. Armies are much more independent, as we've seen, and therefore this thing doesn't quite work. Von Clausewitz says, in fact, the consequence is that enterprises of this description on a flank, which have always been more in fashion in books than in real warfare, let's be honest about this, now appear less of a practical nature than ever. And we may safely say that there is no danger in this respect to any lines of communication, but such as are very long and otherwise unfavorable circumstances, more especially by being exposed everywhere and at any moment to attacks from an insurgent population. Look at Spain. But that's exactly the point, right, that we're saying before. Now, war has come closer to the absolute than in the past, in absolute terms, literally. And therefore, this increases the frontal attack that armies undergo against one another. To pretend that making these fancy maneuvers of outflanking, right, with armies of hundreds of thousands, is where are you going even to find the space, the time, the force, the maneuvering capacity to do it with an army that in itself is just a huge thing that, yes, can be split in multiple times, but actually acts mostly with this punching mass. Why are you if you want to outflank that enemy, you are going to basically to expose your own? In a way, you're giving it advantage of maneuver and marching. Why would you do that? Just crush through it. And this is what von Clausewitz says now. And so, once again, never think that you can perform whatever maneuver you want to do, right, at this point in history, because it's never been true ever. And secondly, it's the least likely moment to do it so far, von Clausewitz is saying, from a Napoleonic perspective. And then he says, with respect to the cutting of an enemy's retreat, we must not be overconfident in this respect either of the consequences of threatening or closing the enemy's lines of retreat, as recent experience has shown that when troops are good and their leader resolute, it is more difficult to take them prisoner than it is for them to cut their way through the force opposed to them. Right? Also because these troops, as we were saying before, not just have that capacity of subsisting them for enough for striking back and trying to break through where they surrounded literally, but because the structure of these armies is so big that at some point these fights can go on over and over with this attritional capacity that is diluting the momentary value of you having cutting their retreats. Right? They function. They stay longer on their feet. They have a greater punching force. So yes, good job if you manage to do it. But von Clausewitz is telling you that the possibility of doing that, you from getting to not doing it to doing it successfully, takes such a toll, a cost, a risk that is not worth it most of the times. Better to punch them in the face at that point. If you have more force at that point, because you are losing forces in doing that, trying to perform that maneuver in the first place, right? And von Clausewitz says the means of shortening and protecting long lines of communication are very limited. The seizure of some fortresses adjacent to the position taken up by the army and on the roads leading to the rear, or in the event of there being no fortresses in the country, the construction of temporary defenses at a suitable points, the kind treatment of the people of the country, strict discipline on the military roads, good police, and active measures to improve the roads are the only means by which the evil may be diminished, but it is one which can never be entirely removed. That is to say, don't think you can keep your lines of communications existing just because of what you can make the people you have deputed to them achieve, because this entire thing is depending on a much broader strategical spectrum, how your army, whatever it is doing compared to the enemy, and what the broader country is gonna do when it's gonna find out that you're retreating, for example, and you are in that condition of inferiority and can overwhelm your supply lines and melt your communication lines and melting your army away much more quickly than you believe. Furthermore, what we said when von Clausewitz says when treating of the question of subsistence with respect to the roads which the army should choose by preference applies also particularly to lines of communication. The best lines of communication are roads leading through the most flourishing towns and the most important provinces. They ought to be preferred even if considerably longer. In most cases, they exercise an important influence on the defensive position of the army. This is also quite important because not only responds to the obvious fact that the larger the army, the easier the way it's going to take, but also the easier ways are paved literally with the most important productive centers of the country. So that is to say, even in relation to guerrilla, guerrilla operates in forests, in mountains, yes, but how are mountains and forests important compared to the flatlands where the overwhelming amount of wealth is concentrated, riches and populace, right? And that's exactly where the army is going to pass, and those areas are normally also the easier to connect, right? Good road to control once occupied, good roads, fortifications that they're meant to control the populations and so on. And less places where to hide in the first place, right? So where's the army's gonna behaving like a compressor roll that is simply gonna pass through and not finding much of an opposition. So that's also the myth of resisting through guerrilla. Yeah, where in a fully populated area, you say, well, look at cities. Yes, but cities are to be supplied in a certain sense. But either you turn that into a into a desert, and I don't know what the broader accomplishment has been. Why are you doing it in the first place? Political and socially speaking, to the sake of the whole country, or what the hell are you doing in the first place? Of course, there are certain situations that become strategically valid like that, but let's say you have to have consistent forces, even in that case, is to put up such a resistance on an open ground, right, and not guerrilla. Right, where you hear guerrilla of mostly terrorist attacks maybe in cities, but not guerrillas. Cities are easy to control than the countryside is, right? So that is important, and not surprisingly, because supply lines, communication lines do pass through also areas that are more peripheral, right? And that's where easier to make ambushes, to make guerrilla and so on. Exactly for this reason. This is what von Clausewitz is telling to us. Alright, so this is pretty much it for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.